Australia will be in debt until 2080. Let's have a look. Hello everyone, Florian.heise here, and welcome to another episode of HeiseSays. Grab your stein of coffee and let's have a look at this article from news.com.au discussing, well, our budget debt and how the the nation will be in debt until 2080. Well, in the early 2080s, so even worse. So let's see, another 60 years. Most of us, most of the viewers of this channel who are in our 40s, the largest demo, are not going to be around. And certainly, majority of the politicians won't be around. So it'll be my children, my children's children, and my children's children's children that will have to bear the burden of this budget deficit. The $1.1 trillion. It's just going to keep growing, we know that. And is it worth it? Is it worth it? Will we reflect back on this time in the future? Will historians look back at the mass hysteria of 2020 that just plunged the world into insane amounts of debt? So, Frydenberg and Morrison have saddled Australia with a century of debt. What a legacy. What a legacy. And how much of it is going to get friddled away? Most Australians alive today, including the Treasurer and Prime Minister, will be long dead by the time the bill for Tuesday's coronavirus cash splash is fully paid off. A baby born on budget night will be nearing retirement. Well, hopefully the concept of retirement will still exist then. On very optimistic projections, we don't think Australia will be debt-free until the early 2080s, said Kane Hussey, research fellow at conservative think tank the Institute of Public Affairs. The federal government has committed to a record $213.7 billion deficit this year as it attempts to borrow and spend its way out of Australia's first recession in nearly 3 decades, brought on by the devastating lockdowns. I mean, you can see here's the deficit. We had a surplus for a little bit, and then, there you go. There you go, everyone. There you go. 1.1 trillion we'll probably reach. The net debt. 1.1 trillion in bonds, but 966.2 billion in net debt. As a share of GDP, there you go, over 40%. Over 40%. They need to have a scale. I guess here's the scale. It should go back to World War II, to the Great Wars. I'd like to see how high debt was a share of GDP back then. By June 2024, Australia's gross debt is expected to reach an eye-watering 1.13 trillion, with net debt peaking that year at 966.2 billion, equating to 36% of GDP. Treasury forecasts gross debt will stabilize at 55% of GDP over the medium term. 55%. I was still shocked when I was looking at it this morning. This is a heavy burden, but a necessary one, to responsibly deal with the greatest challenge of our time, Frydenberg said in his budget speech. The IPA has modeled 2 scenarios, one in which the gross debt peaks at 1.92 trillion in 2037. The budget returns to surplus the following year and the debt is paid off by 2063. I can't see. Can you see that happening? It's never going to get paid off. The second scenario has debt peaking at 2.05 trillion by 2042, a return to surplus in 2046, and the debt paid off by 2080. Here's the thing. The reason why we want a government without debt is then they can start really systematically reducing the burden on their citizens. They will never do it. They'll never do it. In the first scenario, GDP stabilizes at 5%, whereas in the second scenario, it settles at 3%. What? GDP growth? He told news.com.au, budget forecasts tend to be optimistic. So it was pretty depressing that the Morrison government hadn't even tried to outline when we might see a surplus or pay down the debt. Will you ever deliver a surplus? ABC's 7:30 host Lee Sales asked Mr. Frydenberg on Tuesday night. I'm certainly not putting a date on that, Frydenberg said. Well, he probably does. It's never going to happen in his career in Parliament. How many terms will he last? The IPA modelling for both scenarios assumes that once the budget is back in the black, surpluses will be maintained at the Howard-era average of roughly 1% of GDP. If the government is very strict on fiscal responsibility and maintains the budget surpluses, that gets us to gross debt being eliminated by 2080, he said. You know what? I'm gonna bring up trading economics here, because one thing I'm interested in seeing is the indicators for, well, a European country. If we look at Sweden, let's look at some of their indicators. Their GDP is down 8.3%. Their GDP annual growth rate is down. Unemployment rate is at 8.8. Inflation rate is at 0.8. Let's look at government. Where do we have it? Let's go government debt to GDP and government debt, because it'll be interesting to see. So their debt to GDP is 35.1%, so it's going down. We've got the max data. We can see it's been trailing down since 95, 72% at one stage. And we can see here it decreased. There you go. So it's going down. So we'll just have to keep an eye on them, because this is going to be another way of measuring, well, the impacts that their method of dealing with this illness compared to ours, the success rate of it. Here's another measure. You know, how many generations are enslaved with debt? Just think about that. Is it worth it? This is what we need to ask. This is why our leaders need to be held account. This is why the question is, have they been given too much power? Should our political leaders have the power to be able to restrict the nation so much? Is it too dangerous? Have we seen now that maybe it hasn't been worth it? What happens when we have another fright, another scare, another bunch of people that are primed for this, that are thinking, oh, well, you know, they locked down the economy years ago, we better do it again, you know? Now it's going to be really bad this time. Is this a constant concern we're all going to live with now? The IPA modelling for both scenarios assumes that once the budget... Oh, we've read that. If the government is very strict on fiscal responsibility and maintains that budget surplus, that gets us to a gross debt being eliminated by 2080. They're not going to do it. I think they're going to inflate it away. We'll pay for it through taxation and inflation. Maybe GST will go up. Yeah. How's that going to affect our quality of life in Australia moving forward? What compromise decisions will that enforce will that encourage the government to do? So this is wildly optimistic based on strong GDP growth numbers over the short to medium term, very strong fiscal responsibility over the medium to long term, and also assuming we don't have any other economic shocks. He's added, we haven't really looked at a worst case scenario. These scenarios are not worst case. He also hit back at the argument being made by the government and many economists that record low interest rates mean now is the ideal time for Australia to borrow its way to prosperity. Borrow its way to prosperity. So you're subsidizing people doing businesses. I mean, good, it's keeping them in jobs. Fantastic. But is that going to add anything new to the economy? Is that just creating jobs that probably shouldn't be there? Or maybe instead of, maybe people could hire them for that 20 hours and just not do, or maybe hire them for 15 hours as well. That's what'll happen. What's the difference between it? Let's say $100, $25 an hour. There you go, 4 hours less. So normally they'd be hired for 16. Now they're hired for a few more. And we're going in debt for that. I know why they're doing it. I understand, but I'm worried. It sounds a whole lot, but the servicing of debt in the current environment with interest rates super low is very manageable for the federal government, CommSec Chief Economist Craig James said in his budget analysis. Yes, but how low can they stay? Is there going to be calls to nationalise the RBA? have direct government control over it. It's low in the historic sense. It's also low in a global sense. So we shouldn't be overly concerned. The main aim is to get back on our feet. The budget papers note that Australia's annual interest payments, despite being forecast to rise from 16.6 billion this financial year to 17.5 billion in 2024, will actually fall as a share of GDP from 0.9 to 0.8%, reflecting historically low interest rates. But what's been disappointing is to see people pointing to the current cost of borrowing over 10 or 15 years and saying, because that's low, we don't have to worry about how much debt we get into, he said. It doesn't matter what the cost of borrowing is over 10 years. It matters what the cost of borrowing is for the better part of the next century. This is just economic self-harm to put ourselves in such a bad situation. Before the pandemic, we already had 556 billion in gross debt. So we were already in a pretty bad situation debt-wise. The federal budget, which will see spending this year alone soar to 677 billion, forecast that the deficit will be pruned back to a mere 66.9 billion by 2024, but bases that on some very rosy assumptions about the post-pandemic recovery, most notably the nationwide rollout of a vaccine next year. There's absolutely no certainty we'll have a vaccine, he said. What we need to do is move away from this elimination strategy and towards a strategy based on medical capacity, back to flattening the curve, which was the right strategy from the start. Pursuing no COVID cases means no hope for Australia. And he's right there. I mean, this seems insane. The IPA last month published a research paper calling for a move towards a risk-based, proportionate and targeted medical capacity strategy, arguing the lockdowns had caused a humanitarian tragedy that will last for generations. He said ending coronavirus restrictions and allowing life to return to normal should have been the first thing on the agenda. There's no point offering businesses stimulus packages when they don't even have the confidence they can open the doors and remain open, he said. The government must commit to a strategy where they don't pursue devastating lockdowns wherever outbreaks occur. I mean, this is the problem. You've got two different approaches, one at a federal level and one at a state level. He said the political and bureaucratic elites, who are completely insulated from the cost of the lockdown, have imposed restrictions and then kept them in place for far longer than is necessary because they have no skin in the game. We've even seen public servants receiving pay increases, he said. Exactly. So what do you think, everyone? It'll be interesting to compare. And if we have a look here, we can see, well, Sweden's at 35.1. We'll compare Australia, where we are, with regard to government debt to GDP. So we're at 45%. So look at that. We've been just climbing ever higher. Funny that. Which chart looks better? Have to watch and see, guys. How will the historians look back on the decisions made today? Do you think it's good? A smart move from our leaders? Or are you concerned? Do you expect to be alive in the 2080s to see it being paid off? Or will you be nice, comfortable, and no longer worrying about these issues of the mortal world? As always, let me know your thoughts and opinions in the comments below. Please like, share, and subscribe to the channel. If you're a fan and want to support the content I create here, there are a few ways you can. You can join the channel on YouTube or Patreon. You can support us using our affiliate links at Amazon, eBay, Independent Reserve, or Kucoin. You can buy merch from HeiseSays, use Gold Pass from the Perth Mint, or support us via PayPal. Take care, everyone. Have a great day. I'll see you next time.